He said I wasn't wife material. Then I became his boss and fired him. The words play on repeat in my mind, a constant echo that somehow manages to both fuel and quench the fire burning inside me. 3 years ago, those carelessly uttered words shattered my world. Today, they're the reason I sleep soundly at night. I remember the exact moment I heard them. Not from him directly. No, James wouldn't have had the courage for that kind of honesty to my face. Instead, fate delivered his true feelings through the thin walls of our shared apartment building. His voice carried through the ventilation system that connected our bathrooms, a quirk of the building's poor design that had never mattered until that night. I'd been brushing my teeth, mindlessly preparing for bed after what I'd thought was a perfect evening with him. We'd been dating for almost 2 years. Earlier that night, he'd taken me to Costello's, the upscale Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. The candlelight had caught in his dark eyes in a way that made my stomach flutter, just like it had back then. His fingers had intertwined with mine across the table as we'd shared tiramisu. I'd felt certain, so blissfully certain, that he was going to propose soon. Instead, I stood frozen, toothbrush suspended mid-stroke, as his voice drifted clearly through the vent. I recognized the laugh first, that specific chuckle he reserved for conversations with his best friend, Alex. Then came the words that would change everything. Nah, man. Megan's great, but she's not exactly wife material, you know? Too focused on her career. Too intense. Fun for now, though. The toothbrush slipped from my fingers, clattering against the sink with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. Toothpaste foam dripped down my chin as I stood paralyzed, my reflection in the mirror slowly blurring as tears filled my eyes. Wife material. 2 simple words that somehow managed to reduce my entire being, my ambitions, my love, my unwavering support of him through his own career stumbles, to something inadequate, something temporary, fun for now. The worst part wasn't the judgment itself. It was the casualness of it. The way he'd tossed aside 2 years of what I thought was building toward forever, with the same offhand tone he might use to discuss a mediocre movie. And beneath that, something even more painful. The realization that while I'd been planning a future, he'd been planning an exit strategy. My legs gave out, and I sank to the bathroom floor, the cold tiles pressing against my skin as my mind raced through every moment I'd misinterpreted. Every time he'd said, "I love you," had it always come with this silent asterisk? Every conversation about our future, had they been merely hypotheticals to him, fantasies he never intended to realize? The bathroom walls seemed to close in, the space suddenly too small to contain the expanding universe of my pain. I crawled to the bedroom, my body moving on instinct while my mind remained trapped in that moment of revelation. I curled into bed, still in my dress from dinner, makeup smearing against the pillowcase as silent sobs racked my body. Sleep evaded me that night, my thoughts cycling between disbelief, devastation, and a strange, detached analysis. By morning, my eyes were swollen and my throat raw, but a numbness had settled over me, a protective layer between my consciousness and the wound that was still too fresh to examine directly. When my alarm blared at 6:30 a.m., I silenced it with a mechanical precision that belied the chaos inside me. The morning routine I'd perfected over years in corporate marketing provided structure when everything else felt formless. Shower, moisturize, dress, coffee. Each step completed not because I wanted to face the day, but because I didn't know how to do anything else. As I applied concealer to hide the evidence of my sleepless night, a decision crystallized. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. The thought of seeing pity in his eyes, or worse, relief that his unspoken truth had finally surfaced, was unbearable. Instead, I would go to work, lose myself in spreadsheets and campaign metrics, and figure out how to extricate myself from this relationship with my dignity intact. The irony wasn't lost on me. The career focus he'd deemed so unsuitable for wife material would now be my sanctuary. That day at Horizon Marketing passed in a blur. I nodded at appropriate moments during meetings, responded to emails with efficient, emotionless precision, and somehow managed to present a quarterly strategy proposal without my voice betraying me. Colleagues commented on my unusual intensity, mistaking heartbreak for dedication. If only they knew that each PowerPoint slide I flipped through was another moment I wasn't collapsing into myself. My phone buzzed throughout the day with messages from James. Each notification sent a jolt of nausea through me. I couldn't bring myself to read them, much less respond. What could he possibly say that would matter now? Sweet nothings from someone who saw me as nothing more than a temporary amusement? By evening, I'd formulated a plan of emotional self-preservation. I would end things cleanly, without revealing what I'd heard. I would attribute the breakup to vague incompatibilities, sparing both his guilt and my pride. I would move apartments, even though my lease wasn't up for months, the financial penalty seeming a small price to pay to escape the ventilation system that had delivered such brutal truth. What I couldn't formulate was how to stop loving someone overnight, how to unravel the threads of him that had woven themselves so thoroughly into the fabric of my life, how to look at the future I'd imagined and see anything but a gaping void where our shared dreams had been. When I finally returned to my apartment that evening, I found flowers outside my door. Lilies, my favorite. The card read simply, "Missed you today. Dinner tomorrow?" No declaration of love, no promises. Just the casual confidence of someone who assumed his place in my life was secure. I left them in the hallway. Inside, I methodically began the process of erasure. Photos deleted from my phone. His spare clothes placed in a box. The expensive watch he'd left on my nightstand, a birthday gift from his parents that he'd worried about losing, carefully wrapped and placed with the rest of his belongings. Each item removed with the clinical precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. When James called later that night, I let it go to voicemail. When he texted asking if everything was okay, I responded with a simple request to talk tomorrow. Not at dinner, as he'd suggested, but at the coffee shop near my office. Public enough to prevent a scene, brief enough to escape prolonged pain, and timed perfectly to give me an excuse to leave for work immediately after. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, each awakening bringing a fresh wave of realization. By morning, the initial shock had hardened into something colder, more solid. Not quite anger, not quite acceptance, something suspended between the two that allowed me to function. The breakup itself was anticlimactic. His confusion seemed genuine when I explained that I didn't see a future for us. When he asked if there was someone else, I almost laughed at the irony that he would assume only another man could derail what we had, not his own dismissive assessment of my worth. When he pressed for a more specific reason, I simply said we wanted different things from life. It wasn't even a lie. The look of hurt in his eyes nearly broke my resolve. For a moment, I almost told him what I'd heard, almost demanded an explanation. But what would be the point? Either he would deny it, making me question my own reality, or he would confirm it, forcing me to hear those words directed at me intentionally. Neither outcome would heal anything. As I walked away from the coffee shop, leaving him staring at an untouched cappuccino, I felt hollow. I'd expected some sense of power in taking control of the ending, some vindication in being the one to walk away first. Instead, there was just emptiness and the long workday ahead to get through somehow. The weeks that followed blurred together, marked by the milestones of post-breakup recovery, returning his key, arranging through email for him to pick up his things while I was at work, fielding concerned calls from mutual friends who'd heard his version of events, that I'd ended things suddenly, inexplicably. Declining invitations to gatherings where he might be present, finding a new apartment and systematically erasing the traces of him from my life. Through it all, work remained my constant. I arrived earlier, stayed later, volunteered for projects no one else wanted. My boss noticed, mistaking my desperate need for distraction as ambition. When a senior position opened up on another team, she recommended me without hesitation. The promotion came with a substantial raise and new responsibilities that demanded even more of my attention, a blessing disguised as a challenge. My new role involved overseeing digital marketing strategy for several of the firm's biggest clients, including Vertex Solutions, a fast-growing tech company that had recently contracted with Horizon for a complete brand overhaul. 6 months after the breakup, I finally felt something like equilibrium returning. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something less acute, more like a dull background noise I could mostly tune out. I'd started socializing again, though dating felt impossible. Not because I was still in love with James. That feeling had been systematically dismantled by the endless replay of not wife material in my darkest moments, but because trust seemed like a luxury I could no longer afford. Then came the email that would set everything in motion. A notification of a new client meeting with Vertex Solutions marketing department to discuss their upcoming product launch. And there, third on the list of attendees, James Chen, marketing director. My first instinct was to recuse myself from the project, to cite conflict of interest or personal history, but something stopped me. A flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Not quite anger, not quite ambition. Something with sharper edges. I spent that evening researching everything about Vertex Solutions I could find. Press releases, LinkedIn profiles, industry gossip. James had joined them just 4 months ago, after leaving his previous company under circumstances not publicly detailed. The position represented a significant step up for him. The director title he'd been chasing for years, finally achieved. The old me would have felt happy for him, even from a distance. The new me felt something entirely different as I scrolled through his polished LinkedIn profile, with its carefully curated career highlights and its complete absence of personal details. The new me saw opportunity. I arrived at the meeting room 20 minutes early the next day, selecting a seat that would give me a clear view of the door while reviewing the briefing documents with deliberate focus. My hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, my navy suit impeccably tailored, my expression professionally neutral. Armor, all of it. When he walked in, the jolt of recognition that passed across his face was almost worth every sleepless night of the past 6 months. He faltered mid-stride, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his cup. Our eyes met for precisely 3 seconds before I returned my attention to the documents before me, acknowledging him with nothing more than the same polite nod I'd given every other Vertex team member. Throughout the 2-hour meeting, I spoke with clear authority, directing questions to various team members, including him, with perfect professional courtesy. If my voice tightened slightly when addressing him directly, no one seemed to notice. If my gaze never quite met his when he spoke about Vertex's revolutionary approach to consumer engagement, it could be attributed to my careful note-taking. He attempted to catch me after the meeting, hanging back as others filed out. I efficiently gathered my materials, making sure never to be alone with him in the room by timing my exit with that of Vertex's CEO. As we walked out, I heard the CEO comment on my impressive presentation, saw James's tight smile in response. That smile, I recognized it as the same one he wore when pretending to enjoy dinners with my parents. Back in my office, adrenaline finally gave way to trembling. I sat at my desk, hands pressed flat against its surface to steady them, breathing deeply until the shaking subsided. I'd survived. More than survived. I'd demonstrated clearly that he held no power over me, that I could interact with him as I would any other client representative. That was enough, wasn't it? But as days passed and subsequent meetings loomed, I realized it wasn't. The initial shock of our reunion had crystallized into something more complex. Each time I reviewed the Vertex file, each time I prepared materials for our next consultation, I felt a growing sense of purpose that went beyond professional obligation. I began noticing patterns in James's contributions to the meetings. He spoke confidently about strategies I knew he'd struggled to grasp when we were together. He took credit for ideas that came from his team. He interrupted female colleagues while deferring to male ones. Had he always been this way, and I'd been too blinded by affection to see it? Or had his new position revealed aspects of his character that had previously lain dormant? More importantly, I began noticing weaknesses. Gaps in his knowledge that he covered with buzzwords, reports he clearly hadn't fully reviewed, a tendency to commit to timelines without consulting his implementation team, leading to missed deadlines he would later attribute to communication issues. Each observation went into a separate document on my personal laptop, not part of the official client notes, something private, meticulous, growing. Not yet a plan, but the foundation of one. The third meeting was when things shifted significantly. Vertex's CEO announced he'd be stepping back from the marketing overhaul to focus on a potential acquisition, designating James as the primary point of contact for all further interactions with Horizon. My heart sank at the prospect of more direct engagement with him, but my expression remained impassive. After the meeting, James approached me directly, the room now empty except for us. The conversation was brief, painfully professional. He expressed enthusiasm about working more closely together, praised my thoroughness, and suggested we put the past behind us for the sake of a successful partnership between our companies. His eyes never quite met mine, focusing instead on a point just above my left shoulder. I agreed with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, assuring him that our history wouldn't affect my professional commitment to Vertex's success. As I spoke the words, something solidified within me. the nebulous feeling that had been building since I'd first seen his name on the attendee list finally taking definite shape. This wasn't just about enduring his presence or proving I could remain unaffected. This was an opportunity I'd never anticipated but now couldn't unsee. The universe had placed him directly in my professional path, creating a unique intersection of our disparate trajectories. What I chose to do at this intersection would define not just our future interactions, but perhaps my own relationship with the concepts of justice, closure, and self-worth. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I transformed my observation document into something more structured, more intentional. I mapped out Vertex's organizational hierarchy, identified key stakeholders, researched their backgrounds and relationships. I reviewed every email James had sent regarding the project, noting inconsistencies, overpromises, minor misrepresentations that could become significant under scrutiny. By morning, I had the outline of a strategy. Not to sabotage, I would never compromise my professional integrity or Horizon's reputation by delivering anything less than exceptional work to Vertex, but to position myself as indispensable to Vertex's success, while simultaneously ensuring that James's weaknesses became increasingly apparent to those above him. The plan would require patience, precision, the same attention to detail that had made me too intense for wife material, but perfectly suited for corporate advancement. Over the next 2 months, I executed with methodical care. In meetings, I began deferring to James on key decisions, while subtly framing the questions in ways that highlighted areas where I knew his knowledge was superficial. I sent recap emails that documented his commitments precisely, making it impossible for him to later claim miscommunication when deadlines weren't met. I built strong relationships with other members of his team, becoming their trusted advisor rather than just another vendor. When his proposals contained flaws, and they often did, I would identify them privately to him first, positioning myself as an ally helping him avoid embarrassment. He accepted these interventions with visible reluctance, but couldn't afford to reject them, not when the alternatives might damage his standing with Vertex leadership. I was careful never to criticize him directly to others, never to do anything that could be construed as unprofessional. My approach was more subtle, creating situations where his own actions would speak for themselves, where the contrast between his promises and his delivery would become increasingly difficult to ignore. Through it all, I maintained an outward cordiality that must have been maddening to him. Our interactions were unfailingly polite, devoid of any acknowledgement of our shared past. I referred to him as Mr. Chen. In meetings, used James only in direct one-on-one communication and never ever mentioned anything personal. It was as if we were strangers with coincidentally identical names to people who had once shared a life. The turning point came 3 months into the project. Vertex was preparing to present the first phase of our rebranding work to their investors, a crucial milestone that would influence future funding. James had insisted on managing the presentation himself, overriding concerns from both his team and mine about his familiarity with all the technical details. The night before the presentation, he sent me a draft for final review. It was, to put it mildly, a disaster. Slides out of order, metrics misrepresented, competitive analysis that contradicted our research, and worst of all, a complete mischaracterization of the implementation timeline that promised features months before they could realistically be delivered. I had a choice to make. I could correct everything, essentially rewriting his presentation and saving him from certain embarrassment. I could provide minimal feedback, focusing only on the most glaring issues while leaving enough problems to undermine his credibility. Or I could do nothing, allowing him to fail spectacularly on his own. The old me, the one who had once loved him, who had built her sense of worth partly on being needed, would have chosen the first option without hesitation. The person I'd been immediately after the breakup, raw with hurt, might have been tempted by the third. Instead, I chose a fourth path. I stayed up until 3 a.m. creating 2 versions of the presentation. The first fixed everything, restructured for maximum impact, with detailed speaker notes to guide him through even the most technical questions. The second highlighted all the issues in the original, explaining their potential impact and offering alternatives, but leaving the actual corrections to him. I sent both versions at 3:17 a.m. with a carefully worded email. I acknowledged the immense pressure he must be under, expressed confidence in his ability to make the necessary adjustments, but emphasized that the decision of which version to use was entirely his. I pointed out that while the corrected version would certainly be successful, using it might raise questions about authorship if it differed too dramatically from his usual presentation style. In essence, I offered him a perfect solution while simultaneously making it almost impossible for him to accept it without admitting weakness. I knew James well enough to predict that his pride wouldn't allow him to use a presentation so clearly created by someone else, especially not by me. His ego would demand that he make his own corrections, even with limited time and under significant pressure. The next morning, bleary-eyed from minimal sleep but perfectly composed in appearance, I arrived at Vertex's offices for the investor presentation. James was already there, looking considerably worse than I felt, tie slightly askew, a faint coffee stain on his otherwise crisp white shirt, dark circles under his eyes poorly concealed. He'd opted for his own hastily corrected version, as I'd anticipated. Better than his original draft, but still riddled with inconsistencies and ambitious promises that Vertex couldn't possibly fulfill on the stated timeline. When he nodded stiffly in greeting, I responded with a warm smile and a quiet question about whether he'd had time to review my suggestions. His terse, I incorporated what made sense, told me everything I needed to know about the night he'd had. The presentation went exactly as I'd expected. Initial sections were strong enough, but as he progressed to more technical aspects, his explanations became vaguer, his responses to investor questions more defensive. When challenged on the implementation timeline, he doubled down rather than acknowledging the overcommitment, putting himself in a position where failure was now the only possible outcome. I watched it all from the back of the room, my expression one of supportive concern rather than the satisfaction building inside me. When called upon to address specific questions about marketing strategy, I provided clear, detailed responses that subtly highlighted the disconnect between James's promises and realistic projections without ever directly contradicting him. By the end, the shift in the room was palpable. The investors' initial enthusiasm had cooled to cautious interest. The Vertex CEO's confident smile had tightened into something more forced, and James, once so self-assured in his new director role, had developed a slight tremor in his right hand as he collected his materials from the podium. In the debrief immediately following, tensions surfaced. The CEO questioned the timeline discrepancies. The CTO expressed concerns about promised features that hadn't been fully developed. When James attempted to deflect responsibility to various team members, I gently interjected with documentation proving these decisions had been his alone, all while maintaining an air of someone reluctantly setting the record straight rather than pursuing an agenda. The meeting ended with James being tasked to provide a more realistic, revised timeline within 24 hours. As everyone filed out, the CEO asked me to stay behind. My pulse quickened, wondering if I'd overplayed my hand, if my involvement in James's downfall had been too obvious. Instead, the CEO expressed appreciation for Horizon's thoroughness and asked, with careful diplomacy, how confident we were in James's ability to manage the remainder of the project. I responded with equally careful wording, praising James's vision while acknowledging communication challenges that Horizon was committed to helping overcome. I suggested more frequent check-ins and clearer documentation protocols, essentially more oversight of James's work without explicitly saying he needed supervision. The seeds were planted, not with malice, but with precise, factual observations that would inevitably grow into larger concerns. Over the next few weeks, James's position deteriorated further. The revised timeline he'd submitted required multiple corrections, each iteration further damaging his credibility. His team began coming directly to me with questions, bypassing him even for decisions that technically required his approval. In meetings, his contributions were met with increasingly skeptical responses from Vertex leadership. Throughout this gradual unraveling, I maintained perfect professionalism. I never criticized him directly, never rejected his input outright. Instead, I became the reliable counterpoint to his chaos, the steady hand guiding the project forward despite his missteps. In every interaction, I was the consummate professional he'd once suggested I was too much of, the career focus that had made me unsuitable as a wife, now making me indispensable as Vertex's marketing lifeline. The irony wasn't lost on me. nor was the growing sense of hollow victory as I watched him struggling to maintain his facade of competence. There were moments late at night when the intensity of my focus subsided that I questioned what I was becoming. Was this calculated dismantling of his professional credibility really so different from his casual dismissal of my personal worth? Was I proving him right about my intensity, my career focus, by channeling those very qualities into his downfall? These questions would surface briefly before being submerged again beneath the cool certainty that this wasn't about revenge. This was about consequence, the natural outcome of his own actions, his own decisions, his own limitations that I was simply no longer compensating for or concealing. 4 months into what had been projected as a 6-month project, the Vertex CEO requested a private meeting with me and my boss, Sarah. The purpose wasn't explicitly stated, but I had my suspicions, confirmed when we were escorted not to the usual conference room, but to the executive floor. The conversation began with praise for Horizon's work, particularly my contributions. The CEO then shifted to more difficult territory, their dissatisfaction with their internal marketing leadership, specifically James's performance. They were considering a restructuring and wanted to know if Horizon would be interested in an expanded role, potentially embedding personnel directly within Vertex on a contract basis to oversee implementation of the strategies we'd developed. Sarah looked to me before responding, knowing this project had been primarily my domain. In that moment, with an opportunity I couldn't have anticipated presented before me, I made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. I suggested something bolder. Rather than a temporary embedded position, I proposed that Vertex consider creating a new VP of marketing role, someone who would report directly to the CEO, overseeing all marketing functions including the existing director position. This would allow for continuity in day-to-day operations while providing the strategic oversight they clearly needed. When the CEO asked if I was suggesting myself for this role, I smiled and said I'd be open to discussing a transition from Horizon to Vertex if the terms were right. Sarah, though clearly surprised, quickly supported the possibility, noting that while losing me would be a blow to Horizon, our agencies had a history of seeing client recruitment of our talent as the ultimate testament to our value. 2 weeks later, after intense negotiations and careful extraction from my Horizon obligations, I accepted Vertex's offer. The role came with a substantial salary increase, equity options, and most importantly, a clear reporting structure that positioned James directly beneath me in the organizational hierarchy. The announcement was made company-wide via email before my first official day. I received a terse congratulatory message from James, his attempt at professional courtesy barely masking what must have been shock and dismay. I responded with warm enthusiasm about our future collaboration, my words dripping with the same insincerity as his not-wife material assessment had been. My first week as Vice President of Marketing at Vertex was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of leadership. I scheduled individual meetings with every team member, including an hour blocked specifically for James. I solicited input on existing challenges, created forums for ideas that had previously been suppressed, and began reshaping the department's structure to better align with the company's growth objectives. When James finally sat across from me in my new office, larger than his, with windows overlooking the city, the power shift was undeniable. He'd prepared a presentation of his current projects, an obvious attempt to establish himself as still valuable, still in control of his domain. I listened patiently, noting how his explanation of challenges conveniently omitted his own role in creating them. When he finished, I thanked him with the practiced warmth of someone who could now afford magnanimity, then outlined my vision for the department, including several significant changes to initiatives he'd just presented as established and immutable. The look that crossed his face in that moment, a complicated mixture of realization, resentment, and resignation, provided a satisfaction I hadn't anticipated, not because I enjoyed his discomfort, but because in that expression I saw recognition. He finally understood that he was no longer evaluating me against his criteria for a suitable wife. I was evaluating him against my standards for a competent director. Over the next month, I gave James every opportunity to rise to those standards. I provided clear expectations, regular feedback, and resources to address the gaps in his performance. I documented everything meticulously, every missed deadline, every strategy meeting he came to unprepared, every client complaint, alongside my efforts to help him improve. Not out of malice, but out of a commitment to fairness and transparency that would make what came next unassailable. The performance improvement plan I finally placed him on was textbook corporate procedure: measurable objectives, reasonable timelines, weekly check-ins to assess progress. On paper, it looked like the actions of a concerned executive trying to rehabilitate a struggling team member. In reality, it was the countdown to an inevitable conclusion. James's response was exactly what I'd expected: initial compliance that quickly deteriorated into resentment, then visible disengagement. He made token efforts toward the objectives I'd outlined, but his heart wasn't in it. Perhaps he'd already seen the writing on the wall. Perhaps his pride couldn't bear the humiliation of truly trying to meet standards set by someone he'd once deemed inadequate. Whatever the reason, his failure to meet the improvement targets was thoroughly documented by the time I scheduled our final meeting. Human Resources had reviewed everything and supported my decision. The CEO had been briefed and expressed full confidence in my judgment. All the pieces were in place. He knew what was coming when my assistant escorted him to the conference room rather than my office. The HR representative waiting alongside me only confirmed it. His expression remained carefully neutral as I explained that despite our best efforts, his performance continued to fall short of the standards required for his position. That Vertex would be offering a standard severance package in exchange for a clean separation. That his team had already been informed he would be leaving the company, effective immediately. Throughout my delivery of this corporate death sentence, I maintained perfect professionalism. My voice neither softened with pity nor hardened with triumph. I was simply executing a necessary business decision, removing an underperforming element that hindered the company's progress. Only when the HR representative stepped out briefly to retrieve the final paperwork did the veneer crack. Not mine, but his. "This was your plan all along, wasn't it?" he asked, voice low, eyes finally meeting mine directly for the first time since I'd become his superior. "From the moment you saw my name on that attendee list." I considered denial. Considered maintaining the fiction that this was purely performance-based, that our history had no bearing on the present circumstances. Instead, I offered him the honesty he'd never given me. "No, James. This was your plan. The moment you decided I wasn't wife material because I was too focused on my career, that was when this became inevitable. Not because I set out to destroy you, but because you underestimated me. Because you saw my ambition as a flaw, rather than the force that would eventually place me in a position to evaluate your worth." The color drained from his face. "You heard that? When? Bathroom vent? The night after Costello's. But when it happened doesn't matter now. What matters is that you judged me insufficient based on criteria I never agreed to meet, while failing spectacularly at the professional standards you claimed to value." The HR representative returned before he could respond. He signed the separation agreement with a hand that trembled slightly, no longer the confident marketing director, just another casualty of corporate restructuring. As he stood to leave, security waiting to escort him out as per standard protocol for terminated executives, I felt a curious emptiness where I'd expected satisfaction to bloom. I watched from my office window as he exited the building, cardboard box in hand, the universal symbol of professional defeat. He paused on the sidewalk, looking up toward the executive floor as if sensing my gaze. For a moment, I thought I saw his shoulders straighten, his chin lift in one last gesture of defiance. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians, out of my company and out of my life. That night, alone in my apartment, a spacious corner unit in a luxury building my new salary easily afforded, I poured myself a glass of expensive whiskey and considered what I'd accomplished. The career advancement that had once been a means to distraction from heartbreak had become the instrument of a revenge I hadn't initially sought, but had executed with devastating precision. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. The cold satisfaction that had sustained me through months of careful maneuvering had evaporated, leaving behind questions I hadn't allowed myself to consider during the campaign itself. Had I become the very thing I despised in him, someone who measured others against arbitrary standards and found them wanting? Had my pursuit of professional retribution transformed me into someone equally capable of casual cruelty, just in a different arena? Or was there a fundamental difference between his dismissal of my worth as a potential life partner and my evaluation of his competence in a role he'd actively sought? I had no easy answers as I watched ice melt in my glass, diluting the amber liquid into something weaker, less potent. What I did have was the undeniable reality that I now occupied a corner office with his name removed from the door, that the career intensity he'd deemed unsuitable for a wife had made me an exceptional executive, that the professional advancement he'd pursued at the cost of personal integrity had ultimately been his undoing. There was a certain poetic justice in it all, not engineered through deception or sabotage, but through simply allowing natural consequences to unfold. I hadn't falsified reports or manufactured evidence. I'd merely created conditions where his true capabilities would be accurately assessed rather than obscured by charm or deflection. As weeks passed and Vertex thrived under my leadership, the emptiness gradually filled with something else. Not vindication, exactly, but clarity. I realized that my worth had never been dependent on his assessment, that the qualities he'd found unsuitable were precisely what others valued most, that in dismissing me as not wife material, he'd inadvertently freed me to become something more powerful than the partner he'd imagined he deserved. Sometimes I wonder if he understands this now. If, in quiet moments between job interviews, he reflects on the woman he casually discarded and the executive who eventually signed his termination papers. If he recognizes that the intensity he once found so off-putting in a girlfriend proved devastating in a boss. I don't dwell on these questions for long. My focus remains where it always has been, on building something meaningful, on channeling my intensity into creation rather than destruction. The revenge that once seemed so important has faded into just another chapter in my story, significant not for the pain it addressed, but for the strength it revealed. He said I wasn't wife material. He was right, though not for the reasons he thought. I was always meant for something different than fitting neatly into someone else's narrow definition of partnership. I was meant for this, for leadership, for vision, for the kind of success that comes from embracing rather than apologizing for my ambition. And if fate ever brings us together again, in some corporate hallway or industry event, I'll greet him with the same professional courtesy I show everyone else. Not because I've forgiven or forgotten, but because I've transcended. Because the woman who once cried on bathroom tiles over his casual dismissal now occupies spaces he can only aspire to enter. That's the true revenge, not that I became his boss and fired him, but that in doing so I finally understood my own value in terms entirely separate from his assessment. And in that understanding, I found something far more satisfying than vengeance. I found vindication.